And we get to slide 48 of the presentation after 2.5 hours, and then you see the differences in prescribing.
And that is when the air goes out of the room because we have hyped up how amazing these segments are. Everyone is completely bought in on how attitudinally differentiated they are. They can all identify that, everyone knows Dr. Smith and he's a laggard. And everyone's feeling very good about it. And then we get to that prescribing data and it looks exactly the same.